So yesterday, I rather embarrassingly forgot the fourth, or actually, I guess second or third, depending on how you count, of the four types of perception. This is I think, really important to understand that for Dignaga and Dharmakīrti, and thus by extension, the Indian Mahayana Buddhist tradition, and then by extension, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there are four types of perception, not just one. So when we say perception, wrote it out yesterday, pratyakṣa means direct, unmediated ways of knowing. We recall our discussion of pramāṇa as an instrument of reliable or authoritative knowledge. We can know directly or we can know indirectly. We know indirectly through inference, concepts, thought, language. We know directly through perception, or perception just is. What we call the English word perception is translating a word that literally, most literally means a direct as opposed to an indirect way of knowing. And again, there are four such direct ways of knowing. Sensory perception, sensory consciousness, is just the first. It's only one of these. So when we talk about, please come in, yes. When we talk about sensory consciousness, eye consciousness, ear consciousness, whatever, this is perception, but it's only one type of perception. What are the others? The one I forgot, hilariously, is, of course, mental perception. What is mental perception? Not something we're going to go into a whole lot of detail today, because it's kind of tricky, kind of abstract, and kind of beside the point. What do we need to know? Dignaga, the first Buddhist logician to really systematize it all, but however sloppily, actually only makes one statement about perception. Dignaga says, perception is non-conceptual. Stop. Pratyakṣam kalpana podam. Kalpana, I referred to on when we were talking about the three natures. You may remember the imaginary or constructed nature, parikalpita, same root, kalp in Sanskrit, kalp, meaning imagine, construct, arrange mentally. So a cognition, an awareness, a moment, a mental event, devoid of kalpana, of this kind of mental fabrication, is, according to Dignaga, a perception. Dharmakīrti makes one additional stipulation. He says, pratyakṣam kalpana podam abhrantam, non-erroneous. A perception is non-conceptual and non-erroneous. Why does he make this additional stipulation? Because we need to talk about error, bhranti, trulpa in Tibetan. You say like nitrul sometimes in the, when you're reading the text, mitrulpa, non-deceptive, non-erroneous, undiluted. What is delusion or error in this system, in this way, in this pramāṇa way of looking at things? Tukula taught the other day about the two types of wisdom, yes? The wisdom that knows everything as it is, and the wisdom that knows the full range of what there is. The first of these in Sanskrit, yatha bhuta darshana. Bhuta like bhu, like svabhava. Be, exist, is. As yatha, it is. Seeing things as they are is classically in India the point. I mean, this is for Buddhists and non-Buddhists. This is the disagreement between different religious traditions in India is not over should we see things, do we need to see things as they are? It's what does that mean precisely? One of the unique contributions of the Buddhist tradition is to understand this kalpana, this conceptuality, this mental fabrication as inherently deviating from seeing things as they are. This word bhranti comes from the root brahm, meaning to wander. Like wander off a path, right? In fact, this is the same meaning as the English word error. An error is a wandering off. If you're familiar with like a knight errant, you may have heard this phrase, like a knight. What is a knight errant? A knight, like a knight in shining armor, who goes around, wanders around, doing stuff. Error is deviation. So, well, but for good, right? But the idea, so part of the idea here, one of the important ideas here is to conceptualize is to deviate from seeing things as they are. So when Dignaga says a direct way of knowing, a way of knowing the truth reliably, of knowing reality reliably, is non-conceptual. There's an implicit assumption there that it is sufficient for our awareness to be non-conceptual means that it therefore knows reality as it is. That in the absence of concepts, in the absence of mental fabrication and thinking, ipso facto, that just is what it means to know reality. But there's a problem there, right? Because what about, for example, hallucinations? The way this gets explained in the classical literature is by way of two examples. I mean, there's others. I'll mention some others, but the two key examples that you'll see over and over again if you stick around, or maybe if you've been around, you've probably heard over and over again, is the rope snake and the two moons. So, classically, we walk into a barn, it's low light, can't see very well, see a little squiggly thing. We get really afraid. Oh no, it's a snake. In fact, it's not a snake, it's just a piece of rope. So, if we analyze the sequence of events there, what's actually happening? Did we see a snake or did we think we saw a snake? Is there a difference between mistaking a rope for a snake versus dreaming or hallucinating a snake? Of course. I mean, it seems obvious, right? In some ways, maybe a better example, another classical example, is a mirage. If you've ever seen a mirage on the road, it looks kind of wavy, right? Maybe something could be wet, but if you look carefully, if you look closely, you'll see it doesn't actually look like water. If there were actually water where the mirage is, it would look different. What's happening is we are conceptually misinterpreting our non-conceptual sensory experience. The non-conceptual sensory experience of the rope, if we were to pay really close attention, could be identified as a rope. The non-conceptual sensory experience of a mirage looks wavy, but doesn't quite look like water. So if we interpreted it correctly, there wouldn't be an error. Yes. Mirror?
Mirror. Imperfections. We're going to see, like a funhouse mirror, we're going to see an image that it
Right.
has been.
So this is the other kind of error, is the two moons. So classically, if you're drunk, but I mean, you could just press your eyeball, right? I'm pressing my eyeball. I'm looking at Manjushri. I see two Manjushris. It's not a misinterpretation. It's not a question of I'm thinking of a second Manjushri. When you look at the moon, when your eyes are crossed because you're drunk or whatever, it's not a question of conceptual interpretation. The awareness itself deviates from the reality that there is in fact only one moon, only one statue of Manjushri in this room. The error is non-conceptually given to us in our experience, directly, so to speak, right? So we need to distinguish. Dharmakīrti distinguishes. In fact, Dignaga also distinguishes, but he is very sloppy about it and it causes problems. He mentions the two moons, but like after talking about other stuff, and it's all kind of complicated and not a very systematic thinker. Brilliant, not a systematic thinker. Dharmakīrti, much more systematic. So Dharmakīrti adds this additional stipulation. It is not enough for a cognition to be non-conceptual. It must additionally be non-erroneous. Specifically because there are two types of error. There is conceptual error and there is non-conceptual error. In a sense, you could say all conceptual awareness is erroneous, right? So at a relative level, we can kind of distinguish, well, there are better concepts and worse concepts, right? The rope snake. If we identify the rope as a snake, that's sort of obviously wrong, right? If we identify the rope as a rope on a Buddhist perspective, that's still wrong. Crucial. That's why we talked about, that's why we went on with all this detail about Abhidharma and particles, like, right? We're excluding all the causal properties of the particles making up the rope other than their ability in this circumstance to fulfill the functions, the causal functions expected of a rope. That's still erroneous, but it's a helpful kind of erroneous, right? It's a mistake that we need to make. If we didn't make it, we couldn't survive in the world. Talk about evolutionary biology. It's just a thing we need to do as beings in the world to survive. But then there's also this other kind of error that's non-conceptual, that's in some sense you could say built in to the awareness itself. So to bring it back, when we talk about the four types of perception, We have sensory perception. We have mental perception. What is mental perception? Very briefly, it's the non-conceptual mental apprehension of the preceding moment of sensory awareness. This isn't very well developed or understood. It's an active, I'm currently working on putting like a paper together on this, but in cognitive scientific literature, you'll sometimes hear what's called the binding problem. What is the binding problem? Well, we have all these different sensory modalities. We have auditory, we hear things, we see things, we touch. Somehow, this cup, my perception of this cup, right? I have simultaneously a tactile, auditory, and visual perception of this cup, right? These are different sensory modalities involving physically different areas of my body. How is it that they all come together as one thing? My argument in the Buddhist picture, this is the role played by non-conceptual mental perception. Mental perception is that function or faculty which binds all of the sensory modalities together as a single moment, as a single kind of awareness. Yes, but again, the sixth, the mental consciousness. Yeah, we were talking about on day one, the 5 sensory plus the 6 mental. But this is why it's crucial to distinguish between conceptual and non-conceptual, because the cognitive binding happens automatically, subliminally, reflexively, right? It's non-conceptual. Then, separate from that is the thought, that's a cup.
That would be the 7th.
Not necessarily. It could be, but the 7th is more typically associated with with ahamkara, with I making, ego making.
Okay. The female bird who is playing and is having these sensory perceptions of the male who is singing, dancing, and showing off all his colors. She has a preference as to whether or not she likes or does not like, which is what drove the evolution of the beauty of birds. That like or dislike, is that
We'll get there yes. So there's 2 great things. One is the like or dislike, which we'll get to in a second. The other is the colors, which is a great opportunity. Dharmakīrti, I'm about to read, talks about butterfly wing, but it could just as well be a bird wing. Other places it's a painting. So there's a very famous passage in the 3rd chapter, the perception chapter of the Pramāṇavārttika, called the Chitra Advaita. Chitra meaning literally multicolored. Advaita, non-dual. Non-duality, multicolored. Why? Let's start reading the beginning of the passage. That which is aggregated is a conglomerate. This is the opponent speaking now for a second. And this is that which is aggregated is a conglomerate, and in that sense, it is a universal, i.e. a samanya lakshana, as we were discussing yesterday. According to Buddhists such as Vasubandhu, one has a perception of such things. That is to say, we have perceptions of aggregates, aggregated particles. Furthermore, any cognition of a universal is necessarily associated with conceptuality. Bog standard Buddhist logic, right? When there's a universal as opposed to a particular, that's conceptual. Hence, it is wrong to say that perception is free of conceptuality. What's the opponent getting at here? You, Dharmakīrti, or you Buddhist logicians, you want to have your cake and eat it too. You want to say the cup, the bird's wing, is an aggregate, is a multiple. There's many things making it up. But you want to say that you have a perception of it. a direct non-conceptual perception of it. But you also want to say that the awareness, the cognition of a universal, i.e. a conglomerate, is conceptual. So you're contradicting yourself. Now, Dharmakīrti responds, due to a relation with other particles, other surrounding particles, infinitesimal elementary particles that are different from their own previous moments arise from their own previous moments, such that they can produce an awareness. In that sense, they are said to be aggregated, and as such, they are said to be a condition for the production of awareness. From their own previous. So again, if you recall the Abhidharma model that I've been harping on this whole week, each particle only endures for 1/64th of a finger snap. It produces, it is the cause of the effect, which is its own causal derivative, its first derivative, right? Like each moment each particle in a succession of moments is the cause for the effect, which is the next moment of that particle. Well, it's not the same particle, right? But it's the first causal derivative or second causal derivative, third. Each moment there's a new causal derivative in a stream. And when particles are agglomerated, they express their causal power to be able to produce a moment of sensory cognition. But this, I believe, hopefully I got this across already. I mean, this should be old hat at this point in the week. Is it? Does this all sound familiar? People? Okay. Moreover, the distinctive quality that particles obtain does not occur without the other particles with which they are in proximity. Hence, since awareness does not have any necessary relation to any one single particle, awareness is said to have a universal in the sense of a group of aggregated particles as its object. And how could one see a variegated form such as a multicolored butterfly or bird's wing? The opponent responds, that multicolor is a single real color. And Dharmakīrti, by the way, has a very wicked sense of humor. He likes to mock his opponents mercilessly. So he says, then that multicolor is even more, John translates this as psychedelic, than that multicolored butterfly. You know, it's way out there. Like you're saying that there's a single real thing that we're going to call multicolor, chitra. Well, this is nonsense. There is no single entity multicolor, just as a form composed of an arrangement of jewels is not a single entity, but, you know, there's all the individual jewels, right? Two cognitions, no, skip ahead. So here the opponent asks, and this is the key point of this passage. It's not, unfortunately, maybe I can like add it to the packet. This wasn't in the packet originally. I didn't want to overload you, but we'll get there. If singularity is not possible in the case of objects such as a bird's wing or a butterfly's wing that have variegated appearances, blue over here, yellow over there, then how can there be a single cognition whose cognitive appearance is variegation? So here I want to pause, and this is why I wrote this on the board. There's this really, 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 really important concept or argument, let's say, called neither one nor many. In Tibetan, Chiktanyi Judrowa, free from one or two. In Sanskrit, originally, Eka Aneka Vichara, the reasoning of one and not one. What does this mean? This goes back to that Abhidharma principle that I was talking about on the first day. In the Buddhist picture generally, as I should emphasize in the picture of contemporary physics, math, and science, generally speaking, the only candidate for a truly fundamentally real entity is something indivisible, ultimately singular, cannot be divided, cannot be broken, cannot be analyzed. What is the purpose? What is the point of this kind of analysis? In the most blunt term possible, the analysis of the self, right? We think of ourselves as unitary, singular, but in fact we're made of parts. When we start analyzing these parts in terms of the 5 aggregates, the 5 skandhas, we see there is no singularity, there is a multiplicity of particles, physical particles, rupa dharmas, feelings, sensations, consciousnesses, and so on. However, and this is in a sense, you could say, the transition point between the pre-Mahayana and the Mahayana. In pre-Mahayana world, that's enough. In Mahayana analysis, in particular in the perfection of wisdom, in subsequent literature, when you really analyze, for example, a particle, for example, along the lines of Vasubandhu in the 20 verses that we read, right? Where Vasubandhu pushes this point to its logical conclusion. You want to say that a particle is an ultimately singular entity, but then how is there agglomeration of particles? We need particles to be singular for them to be real, but we need them to have parts in order for them to agglomerate. Uh-oh. So what is the force of this neither one nor many argument? Fundamentally, it's a point against a naive realism. The idea is, since we are unable to establish particles or anything at all as having truly, unproblematically, either a singular or a multiple nature, they cannot be real. If the only way for something to be real is for it to be eka, singular, and yet we cannot establish that things are either eka or aneka, either singular or multiple, then we are forced logically, scientifically, to conclude that things are not real in the way that we ordinarily take them to be. We continue. Might there be variegation in a single cognition? So to bring it back, so here, and then this is the force, of course, of this line of argumentation. So this whole time, up to this point, about 3/4 of the way through the Pramāṇavārttika, Dharmakīrti is using something pretty much identical to what we were discussing on the first day with the Abhidharma, right? Where, okay, we have physical particles that are momentary and indivisible, but we also have cognitions, mental events, which are momentary and indivisible. So a mental event lasts for 1/64 of a finger snap, and we take it to be ontologically singular and indivisible. Manifestly, however, purely just because it's the easiest to talk about and I think the most intuitive, visual consciousness has internal variegation, does it not? We see blue over here, yellow over there, red up, green down, whatever, in our visual field. So just as Vasubandhu's analysis of particles forced us to conclude that physical matter cannot be real, Dharmakirti's analysis of cognition in precisely the same terms forces us to conclude that awareness itself cannot be real, at least as we ordinarily take it. Those who analyze reality make a statement that is entailed by real things themselves, namely that the way in which we think of objects is just the way in which those objects disappear. Get back to that. The opponent objects, might there be variegation in a single cognition? Dharmakīrti replies, there should be no variegation in the cognition as well. But if one is content to have this be the object's essence, who are we to object to that? Therefore, neither the objects nor the awareness has a spatially extended appearance, because since this has already been disproven in the case of a singular entity, it is also not possible in the case of what is many. And then here, Dharmakīrti does something. I'm going to pivot to what's actually in the packet I put together. Here now, Dharmakīrti does something related but different. He says that part of awareness that seems external, object appearance, is different from that part of awareness that seems to be the subjectivity that apprehends it. Awareness is not differentiated, but its appearance is differentiated into two. That being the case, that dualistic appearance must be cognitive error, Bhranti. The non-existence of one of the two in awareness eliminates the existence of both. Therefore, the emptiness of duality is the suchness, tattva, of the awareness. The true nature of awareness is the emptiness of duality. What's going on here? Dharmakīrti has turned the eka aneka vichara. Now, it's not just about particles, and it's not even just about phenomenal variegation of blue, yellow, red, green, etc. Now he's saying, look, here we have a moment of awareness that we know from prior logical investigations in the Abhidharma and so on. In order to be real at all, it must be singular. It must be indivisible. And yet, it is presented to us as though it had two parts. What is the true nature of awareness? This is circular. I don't know how else to. This circle is like a moment of awareness, right? What is the true nature of a moment of awareness is singular and indivisible. The true nature is devoid of any duality by logical necessity. So, anytime there is any type of distinction, phenomenal distinction between subject and object, that is cognitive error. That is non-conceptual cognitive error. It's not a question of misinterpreting our experience, thinking that a mirage is water or that a rope is a snake. It's built into the experience itself. What's going on here? We have a bunch of particles agglomerated together, producing a moment of awareness. We take this to be perceptual. We said there are four types of perception. Talked about sensory perception, mental perception briefly. Yogic perception is about here with the Four Noble Truths, very, very briefly. Classically, going all the way back to the suttas, each of the Four Noble Truths has four aspects, akaras. This word akara is very interesting. In fact, in terms of Buddhist logical and phenomenological analysis, each of these is called an akara. This is called the akara of the grasper or the apprehender, the subjective akara, grahaka akara, and this is the grahya akara, the aspect of the grasped, the image of that which is apprehended. Here, the word akara means something slightly different. In fact, it's a mode of operation of prajna. So when we cultivate on the path, we exercise prajna. And this prajna, which is itself a dharma, of course, has 16 distinct, specific, special modes of operation that know each of these four aspects of the Four Noble Truths. That's yogic perception, the third type. It's not like, oh, you can't talk about it or think it's actually in a sense very mundane. This is more of a side note. I didn't want to leave it out. The fourth type of perception is reflexive awareness, svasamvitti. I mentioned on the first day and a couple times since then. What do we mean when we say reflexive awareness is a type of perception? In what sense is it non-conceptual and non-erroneous? Well, let's skip ahead a bit in the perception chapter to what I really take to be the heart of the matter. This is the grand finale. Dharmakīrti asks, rhetorically, what is the awareness of an object? I'm aware of a cup. What does it mean to say I'm aware of a cup? What is the awareness of an object? The opponent responds, the experience of an object is just that perceptual cognition that is restricted to a specific individual. Why? Because it has the form, i.e. the akara of that object. So classically, and you'll see this all over the place if you read, Buddhist epistemological literature in translation or scholarly articles or whatever, what does it mean to have a perception of an object? It means for there to be an akara of that object in awareness. The particles making up the cup have certain causal properties. These causal properties produce an effect in the mind. This effect is called specifically the akara of the object akara, the objective aspect of awareness. Now, we already know, because we've already discussed, this object appearance is necessarily accompanied by a subject appearance. But let's set that to the side for a moment. Dharmakīrti notes that definition is insufficient. And the opponent asks why. Dharmakīrti asks, how are these particles of the object produce the image in the awareness? How, in what sense, do they conform to that extended appearance? The cognition does not possess the form of the object. Or if it did, it would be insufficient to define that cognition as the awareness of the object. It would not be able to establish that the cognition has the nature of being an experience of the object. So to bring it back here, again on this picture, what is the object? The physical object that we're supposedly perceiving? An agglomeration of particles. Each particle is infinitesimally small. Our awareness appears extended. So there's a structural mismatch between the external object and the appearance, yes? I mean, it looks like it has volume, right? Objects in the world that we take ourselves to be perceiving look like they occupy space. They don't appear to be,
Three-dimensional.
they're three-dimensional or two-dimensional, even whatever, you know, like you look at a sheet of paper. The actual object, the actual real thing on a, like a sort of taking our, you know, not doing advanced yogacara mind-only stuff. We're just, let's take external realists at their word. We're not going to push the matter. The real things that exist are infinitesimal particles. Our awareness is not of infinitesimal particles. Our awareness appears extended, appears multicolored, variegated. These can never line up. Sensory awareness is inherently erroneous for at least two show-stopping reasons. There's this, and then there's this, right? We have structural mismatch between the particles and the extension, and then we have in each moment of awareness, unless we're doing advanced meditation, phenomenal duality of subject and object, which is just another form of variegation. So if the definition of that which is experienced is that due to which the sensation arises, an immediately preceding cognition with the same object would be that which is experienced. So the opponent tries to wiggle out of this dilemma, right? Says, well, what if we just identify it as the cause of the experience, right? We say the object of an experience is that which causes the experience. Seems straightforward. The problem is the immediately preceding moment of cognition is also the cause, right? In just the same way, we have at time 0 a particle, at time 1 its first causal derivative, at time 2 its second causal derivative. Just so with awareness. Talk about the aggregate of consciousness. One moment of awareness is the cause of the next moment of awareness, is the cause of the next moment of awareness. So when you're talking, you want to say that the object of a perception is that which causes the perceptual awareness. You could just as well be talking about the preceding moment of awareness. Doesn't solve the problem. The experience is of that moment of awareness. And it is of the nature of that moment of awareness. It is not the experience or the nature of anything else at all. Moreover, the fact that the moment of awareness is the nature of the experience is just what constitutes the property of that moment of awareness being directly, and here he uses the word pratyakṣa, individually known. So again, when we're talking about a perceptual cognition, for example, the perceptual cognition of a cup or a bird, what is it exactly that we're knowing? We already went through yesterday a fine-grained temporal causal analysis, right? Remember, you know, that the moment that the particle of the cup exists, there is not yet any awareness of the cup. At the moment where there's the awareness causally produced by the particles of the cup, the particles that caused being the cause no longer exist. The effect is the awareness, the cause is the preceding moment of the particles, right? So what is it that we're actually knowing directly? Pratyakṣa. It's not the cup. It's this, right? It's the object appearance. This is what we're actually directly aware of.
Difficulty with this, of course, and I like to look upon the aggregates of my own body and of my toe, but being a part of my body and yet being separate and hitting my toe, and that pain is from a past event.
Right, but in the moment that you're experiencing the pain, this is actually this. So this gets us back to the what you were saying earlier about liking and disliking. The key point is that our likes and dislikes, pleasure and pain, that's all here. These are the subjective aspects of the awareness. So ordinarily, right, we take, this is a great cup. I love this cup. It's the best cup ever. That's not my personal opinion. That's an objective statement of fact. This cup is amazing. Is sort of how we go about our lives, right? We attribute precisely because there's confusion, precisely because we fail to understand that in fact a moment of awareness is indivisible. We blur or fuse the subjective aspects with the objective aspects. In fact, these are all happening simultaneously because they're not, this division is not real. It's erroneous. It's an artifact of ignorance. But we take, yes, our likes to be, we take desirability to be an objective feature. Desirability is not a feature of the object, it's a feature of subjective aspect.
This is erroneous perception is like a disease. This separateness that we experience, say, within ourselves, and the healing of it and bringing it into unity can cause a healing of this. I mean, I think this is what miracles are.
Right, so Dharmakīrti says there's not something else to be experienced by the cognition. There is not something else that is the experience of that. Therefore, cognition illuminates itself. Cognition illuminates itself. So we say, so here there's a kind of debate that's in the background over, there's an idea that consciousness illuminates its object. So in the Indian language and the metaphor. So to perceive the cup is in some sense for our minds to illuminate the cup is the idea. So Dharmakīrti here is pointing out by asking, what is exactly doing the illuminating and what exactly is it that's being illuminated? Is it the cup that's being illuminated? Not directly. We could say in a sense indirectly, but no. What's happening when we analyze carefully, the cup, the particles making up the cup are producing an image in awareness. This image in awareness is what is illuminated, but it's also what's doing the illuminating. awareness, consciousness, illuminates itself reflexively. When we say, like, he carries himself well. Himself is a reflexive pronoun, right? When he touches himself on the arm. When I touch myself on the arm, is the agent of touching and the object that is touched two different things? No. We can speak of them grammatically, can analyze them intellectually, pull them apart if we wish, just in some metaphorical sense. But in reality, which is to say in terms of causal analysis, when I touch myself on the arm, the one doing the touching and the one being touched are the same. Just so here.
Because I keep thinking of reflecting.
Yeah, reflexive and reflective are two completely different things, and this gets confused in the scholarly literature as well, because there's a whole big debate that happens in the scholar literature about reflexive versus reflective awareness. Reflective awareness would be, yes, this idea that somehow our awareness reflects off of the cup, right? That's transitive. I don't know if you're familiar with like transitive versus intransitive verbs. Doesn't really matter. No, it's the idea is in a single moment of awareness, the illuminator and the illuminated are identical.
So reflects.
A reflex, like when you like when you hit your knee or whatever. Okay, so now the objector continues. All right, but if there is no external object, so at this point we've sort of conceded, okay, sure, it doesn't make, and if you think about it again logically, and this is contemporary cognitive science as well, like it really makes no sense to think that, like, in a direct sense, the object of perception is extramental particles, right? Like what we see is a cognitive appearance. It is not physical matter in and of itself. So if there is no external object, what accounts for the experience of blue or whatever? Dharmakīrti responds, that color, such as blue, is a property of the cognition, and it is also the experience itself. As such, although we commonly call it an experience of blue, in fact, it is an experience of its own nature. Just as an illuminating light is considered to be the illuminator of itself because of having that nature of light, just so awareness is aware of itself. And so if what is known is an object that is something else apart from awareness, it is impossible to establish a knower and a known on the part of that awareness. This structure, this arrangement, the distortion of a separately characterized apprehender and apprehended is constructed in accordance with the manner in which those who are in error observe an awareness that is in fact devoid of the images of the knower and the known. Images of knower and known here is a translation of grahya akara and grahaka akara. When that structure is constructed in that way, then the characterization of cognition as having an apprehended and an apprehender in accordance with ordinary distorted experience is not objectionable in conventional terms. But even then, because there is no awareness of anything else, reflexive awareness is asserted to be the result. So, what is the fault? What is the problem if we say that an external object is observed. There is none at all. But what precisely do you mean with this statement, an external object, extramental object? There's some object outside the mind that's experienced. A single cognition has a dual form. This is the central problem. This is the central error. A single cognition has a dual form. It appears as though there's a subject of experience, an I, a self, an Atman, and an object of experience, that which is experienced. This is just how things appear to be. And if we never heard otherwise and never practiced otherwise, we might never know. Maybe, take some funny mushroom or something and have an experience otherwise. But for the most part, this is just how we live our lives, right? Just how things appear to be. But we know, first of all, logically, that this cannot be real, that this picture of a subject knowing an object doesn't work. Awareness, a moment of awareness, an instantaneous mental event, presents both subject and object simultaneously. This isn't in Dharmakīrti's text, but I like to think of this as, for those of you who are familiar with geometry, the origin, 0, 0, 0, 0 of a coordinate system. What is phenomenal subjectivity? It is the feeling of being at the center of our own universe, right? Looking out at the world, which is like everything that's not the origin, right? That's just how cognition is structured ordinarily. One of the points here is, even within that structure, at any given moment, there is no way to separate the subjectivity from the object appearance. The feeling of liking or disliking or being indifferent from that which appears. They're not actually ontologically distinct. At each individual moment, awareness is illuminating itself. There's some confusion that happens here, in part because Dignaga is quite sloppy. And then because it's kind of mind-bending, it's a little difficult to wrap our heads around. Dignaga calls the subjective aspect of experience self-appearance, sva-abhasa, self-appearance. The problem is he doesn't really distinguish between like the appearance of oneself, this first personality, as it's sometimes called, for me-ness in cognitive scientific literature, phenomenological literature, and cognition's own appearance. There's a slipperiness here that I'll emphasize. So far, I've been talking about flexible awareness in a sense grammatically, right? A moment of awareness is a single, indivisible ontological unity that In a metaphorical sense, you could say illuminates itself. That's how Dharmakīrti likes to talk about it because it's much more precise. There's a different way that it gets talked about, but you have to be really, really, really careful. Really careful. The other way you can talk about it is in terms of self-appearance. What is reflexive awareness? Like, what is it, right? I've sort of talked to how it works in a sense. Like, what is it? There's a commentator I really like, one of the early commentators on Dharmakīrti, who actually wrote a commentary on Dignaga, but like with a Dharmakirtian lens. He identifies reflexive awareness explicitly as the cognitively naturedness of cognition, jnana rupa. The fact that jnana, awareness, has the form, rupa, of awareness and nothing else. I call this experientiality as such. Experientiality as such. The experiential nature of experience. Prior to any particular phenomenal content, prior to the appearance of blue specifically or yellow specifically, in order for there to be an appearance of blue or yellow, there has to be mere appearance. Is another word that gets used. Mere appearance. Awareness prior to any specific thing that we're aware of. And I don't mean a thing like in this, I don't mean like an external thing. I mean internally, within the mind. Prior to any differentiated phenomenal content, there is phenomenality. Not coincidental. This is what gets picked up in the meditative literature, in the contemplative literature, Mahamudra, yes? We're not talking about a specific appearance. We're not talking about a specific phenomenon. We're talking about mere luminosity, not the illumination of some bird's wing or butterfly's wing, but the luminosity itself, mere experientiality itself. It's tricky because it can be really hard. How do you separate that from subjectivity? The subjective nature of experience from the experiential nature of experience. It's slippery, it's subtle, easy to confuse, not necessarily super well defined. I would still say this is why I like this geometric metaphor, or the way Dharmakīrti talks about it grammatically. It makes it easier to understand that these are not quite the same thing. Because as long as, and this is another key point, as long as there is this feeling of being the one who is experiencing, the feeling of being the one who is experiencing is not quite the same thing as just the raw experientiality. I don't know how much sense that makes. Hopefully it'll make more sense when Rinpoche comes next week. And
these severe phenomenal experiences leading to the recognition of this luminosity, like near-death experiences, hitting your toe, having just a horrible situation, and certain they go very internal, discover this internal luminosity.
right, well, that's the key. Again, notice words that were not there. Pleasure and pain. Pleasure is an experience or a feature, subjective feature of experience. Pain is also a subjective feature of experience. In terms of their merely experiential nature, pleasure and pain are identical. When something other than the mind is considered to be the object, that is the cause of the mental representation, that extramental object is not established as something desirable or undesirable in and of itself. The experience of that mental representation is what is desirable or undesirable. When the nature of a cognition is experienced as a desirable image, an ishta akara, an akara of that which is desired, or otherwise, i.e. not desired, approach, avoid, like psychology, right? The object is sensed as being desirable, undesirable by virtue of this image. And again, by object here, we could mean the cup, but we could also mean quite like the subjective feeling of pain at stubbing your toe, right? And even if an external object were to exist, the nature of that object can only be ascertained as desirable or undesirable in accord with how it was experienced. It could not be ascertained as desirable or undesirable by virtue of its own nature, since then there would be the fault of a non-singular nature. So this is my cup, and I think it's the best cup on the planet. And if you think otherwise, you're stupid. And there's this other person who thinks this is the worst cup ever made. Well, he's just wrong. Thing is, if the desirability or undesirability of the cup were a feature of the cup as opposed to a feature of our awareness, well, then we're right back at the ekaneka vichara, right? We would be talking about a single thing, a single cup, a single particle that had a nature that was simultaneously desirable and undesirable. And even if it is accepted that an entity is desirable or undesirable by virtue of its inherent essential nature, there could be no experience of an inherently desirable or undesirable object as different on the part of two different people. Therefore, even if the epistemic object is external, i.e. extramental, existing outside the mind, it is correct that reflexive experience is the result because the object is determined precisely in accord with the manner in which its nature is reflexively experienced. In this case, when there are external objects, one simply relies upon the cognition's property of having the appearance of the object as the epistemic instrument for that object. But in this case, one does not rely upon the subjective nature, even though it is present, because its object is not separate from cognition. That's a lot of words to say. Again, this object is presented thusly through reflexive awareness. Everything we experience, good, bad, desirable, undesirable, or indifferent, neutral, whatever is experienced reflexively or through reflexive awareness. So why, when I said that there are 4 kinds of perception but really only one, the whole point of pramana literature, again, is to know decisively, scientifically, indubitably. For ordinary purposes in our ordinary lives, there is certainly nothing wrong with, for example, visual cognition. If you were blind, it's not very pleasant to be blind. The question here, first of all, is what are we actually seeing? What is the actual object of experience? Careful analysis reveals this to be nothing other than our own minds. What the mind knows directly, pratyakṣa, is itself reflexively. But then there's this additional problem with the little dots there and the structural mismatch, right? Sensory perception can never be non-erroneous. Sensory perception is inherently erroneous. Mental perception bundles this and gives us an error platter. Yogic perception is not this is not Mahamudra, right? This is, in fact, conceptual. I didn't get into it because it's kind of a side note. Yogic perception is conceptual. We're talking about, for example, the first noble truth, first aspect, impermanence, anityatva. Anityatva. Tva means ness. Impermanence-ness, whatever. This is a concept. What actually is impermanence is the causal feature of particles that they only last for at most 1/64th of a finger snap. We don't see that. We see things degrade over time, but that's not the same thing. And we can reflect on this. We can study the Abhidharma, contemplate, meditate on impermanence, achieve a certain kind of understanding that all dharmas have this property of being impermanent. We can have a kind of vivid experience of that. That's a very vivid experience of a concept. Not Mahamudra, not Dzogchen. That's something else, right? And precisely insofar as it is conceptual, ultimately, and if you really want to get really, really down to brass tacks, erroneous. The only ultimately non-erroneous form of perception, form of awareness at all, is reflexive awareness, which is by nature devoid of any specific phenomenal content.
When the audience is watching the performer, this reflexive awareness is the response of the audience to the performer. So the female bird is watching Elvis perform, and whether she likes him or not is the feedback loop that creates, whether or not he gets what he wants, which is to pass on his genetic material. And this genetic material changes based on her reflexive response to his performance, how he looks, how he sings, how he dances. This is a reflexive response.
Well, not in the sense that we're, again, reflexive here is a feature of, so I mean, you have to imagine, right? Like here I've kind of isolated, like from the diagram yesterday, right? When it was talking about like the one moment and the next moment, and like this is like the next moment, right? But this is just itself like one moment. In reality, we could talk, I mean, I guess it's probably going to erase this now. So we're talking about a stream, right? This is one moment of awareness, the next moment of awareness, next moment of awareness. Reflexivity is a feature of each of these moments individually. Reflexivity is the fact that at each time, at each moment, in each mental event, the mental event presents itself. Self-presenting is maybe I haven't used that before, but I'm trying it out and I don't hate it. Self-presenting. Since the nature of the object is presented, nivishta, this is great, fortuitous, in cognition as desirable or undesirable, it is determined as desirable or undesirable. This object is presented thusly through reflexive awareness. Hence, the nature of that object is not observed apart from that very reflexive awareness of the object appearance. There is no seeing that is not reflexively aware seeing. And that is just that which is asserted to be the awareness of the object. When you say there's a object, what there is the reflexive self-presentation of the sensory cognition produced by the object. What we are aware of, again, for the 6 millionth time, is just the mind itself. Yes? The object as presented in cognition is the instrument of the awareness. The awareness pertaining to that instrument is the resultant activity. Since the awareness appears in the manner in which the object presents, because the cognition of the object has that awareness as its nature, even though it is in fact an awareness of itself, even though it is in fact an awareness of itself, it is considered to be the awareness of the object. Therefore, there is also no difference in object between object awareness and reflexive awareness. When one examines the nature of object awareness, the result is said to be reflexive awareness because object awareness has reflexive awareness as its nature. The object, whether of one type or another, is the cause of the cognition which appears in that way. Thus, the external object is considered to have the property of being the epistemic object, i.e. the prameya. So again, there's this question of like intellectual analysis or grammatical analysis. If you really insist, if you have a personal emotional aversion to the idea that all phenomena are only mind, if this upsets you for some reason, or you think it's impossible to like put together a society of laws in the absence of extramental matter, then you can say, sure. Even though, like, it's not in question, right, that cognition is self-illuminating. That what we directly know is the mind itself. But if this is personally upsetting, then we can say, if you insist, that the formal philosophical object which is known exists externally to the mind. There's no, we can't rule that out necessarily. Epistemic just means of or relating to knowledge. Like epistemology is the study of knowledge. Episteme is a Greek word, knowledge. And this is my personal favorite verse of the Pramāṇavārttika. Having set aside the form of the object, how could there be any apprehension of the object on the part of that cognition which ostensibly has the appearance of the object? So in other words, we've deconstructed thoroughly, like I don't even know what we're talking about anymore. To which Dharmakīrti responds, honestly, I don't understand such a thing either. And here is, I think if there are 13 verses that are the only 13 verses that you take away, these are the 13 verses I would take away. Even though the nature of awareness is undifferentiated. So this, like, again, this is just an error. This is just, we're ignorant. This ignorance feeds into every moment, but this is actually not real, right? Even though the nature of awareness is undifferentiated, those with distorted vision characterize it as though it were differentiated into object, subject, and awareness. This characterization is distorted because even though for those whose eyes are impaired by magic spells, mantra, shards of clay may appear in some other manner, such as elephants. This is a classic example of, magician's trick, right? The magician, you have shards of clay on the ground, you say some mantra, sprinkle some whatever on it, and then it deceives people. People hallucinate an elephant or whatever. Despite lacking that nature, those clay shards are not seen in that way by those whose eyes are not garbled. So famously, the Buddha is not deceived by magician's tricks in this way. Or it is like how in the desert something small is seen as large from afar. Although this structure of apprehended, apprehender, and awareness as epistemic object, instrument, and result does not really exist, it is constructed in accord with distorted experience. Otherwise, how could there truly exist multiple cognitive images on the part of a single thing having appearances with multiple diverse forms? In reality, the nature which phenomena are perceived to have does not exist, since they do not have either a singular or a manifold nature. In common parlance, from seeing some similarity, a mistake supposedly arises by attributing some nature to that which does not have that nature. Here, this is not what we're talking about, because not even a single thing having that nature has ever been observed in this universe. In other words, there has never been a single thing with two natures. There has never been an awareness that actually had an ontologically distinct subject and object. However, there is also this kind of error, i.e., one that arises from an internal distortion. It arises naturally from a flaw, and it has a false appearance without depending on seeing any similarity, as in the condition of seeing floaters. So this is not externally imposed. This is not produced by anything other than our own. It calls this the internal distortion, the internal error. There has never been duality. And yet, because of beginningless ignorance, duality nevertheless appears. So, what is the purpose of Buddhist logic, Pramāṇa, this outer science of logic? I think this is where, to me at least, this all comes to a head, is in the understanding of the nature of phenomenal duality, just as beginningless ignorance. We started brief course, analyzing gross material objects into their smallest constituents. We pushed this analysis further at Madhyamaka. We problematized the very notions of cause and effect. We saw that all phenomena are empty. We glossed this emptiness in the Madhyanta Vibhaga, distinguishing the middle from the extremes. What is emptiness in the Yogacara picture? It's the absence of duality in reality, right? What does that mean operationally, concretely? It means when we conduct the most fine-grained phenomenological analysis possible, when we really closely, carefully examine the nature of our experience, what we find is that our very experience itself, to the extent that ordinary appearances appear to be spatially extended, to occupy time and space, to not be instantaneous, to be differentiated, variegated. Blue over here, yellow over there. Nilapita in Sanskrit is a classic example. All of that in the final analysis, in the final logical analysis, must be understood as error, distortion, something we have the vision of things they actually are, the wisdom that knows things actually are. This is not that. It's a deviation from that, right? So on this model, what is meditation practice? What is the most important, salient type of meditation practice? Learning how to recognize the non-dual nature of experience, the non-dual luminosity that just is the experiential nature of experience, or the phenomenal nature of phenomena, prior to their apparent differentiation into anything at all. Questions?
You say that reflective awareness is the logically established round of reality.
Yeah, 100%. I don't think that's trite.
Well, like
I would say this. it what is this? Easy to say, hard to do. Yeah,
Word like.
yeah. But I really want to emphasize, like, this is, I would challenge anyone. I would like, the logical part is important, right? This is not, frankly, up for debate.
That's like, that's
Yeah.
logically established.
Yeah,
You know, we can talk about non-duality, we can talk about experience, we can talk about this, we can talk about phenomenology, we can talk about empiricism, all of that stuff, and argue all day long. But this, you know, we follow this through. The purpose of Buddhist logic is to
yeah. But I would even, I mean, we call it Buddhist logic because historically it exists within this tradition, but, and that's another important point. Also related to Mahamudra, we were talking the other day at lunch or something, like, the nature of the mind is the same whether you're Buddhist or not Buddhist. Like, this logic holds whether you're, Buddhism doesn't have a patent, right? The in operational terms, like, as a historical matter, this way of looking at things was more closely associated with Tantra, like Dzogchen and Mahamudra classically require tantric empowerment. We have to do certain rituals. That, even on its own terms, should be understood as a kind of aid. Makes things easier than they would otherwise be. In principle, there's no inherent reason. Now, of course, there's all sorts of non-inherent reasons, let's say, but there's no inherent reason why whatever Hindu sadhu could just, sit and have this experience of non-dual luminosity and attain Buddhahood, or what we would call Buddhahood as Buddhists, right? But it's not, it's just the nature of the mind, and it's just what you arrive at when you pursue logic to its logical conclusion.
Experientially arrive at it. All these methods prescribed.
The methods certainly speed things up. Yeah.
Why this word gnosis versus reflective awareness? Why do you?
I wouldn't say versus. Gnosis is gnosis.
I think one of the things that's tripping everybody up is this, the English.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I don't know if it's like, you'll have to tell me after like, I don't know if like using all this Sanskrit helps or hurts. I like to think if I provide enough different translations that it helps more, hopefully, than it hurts. But I mean that, because otherwise, yeah, it's like, what word are you even using in English? And
Linda's question, it seems still hung up a bit on the term reflexive awareness, and what reflexive means, apprehension.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Okay.
So Sanskrit root jna, which we get jnana, you will notice this also same as, no, all the same Indo-European root. Jnana is like a really, more so, prajna, like in the Abhidharma, means a specific mental factor that apprehends. It's like the intellectual faculty, right, that we talked about on Monday, and then relates to the Four Noble Truths. And we, like, when it's perfected, we could call it perfection of wisdom, prajna paramita, as in, etc. There's some semantic drift, but prajna tends to mostly mean the same kind of thing over however 2,000 years. Jnana kind of doesn't, or it always means something having to do with awareness, but like in the Pramāṇavārttika, Dharmakīrti will use jnana to just talk about some. I mean, it's not as common as other words, but could just mean like a cognition, nothing special about it. In Tibetan, this becomes famously, share, right? It's terrible, but this is yeshe in Tibetan. So And that means something more exalted, typically. In Sanskrit, Indian Buddhist tantric literature, there's typically much more of this than, which is why, so like gnosis is that's more directly from the Greek, right? Like know is a Germanic take on it. Gnosis is from like Platonic literature, right? Where we mean a certain kind of, sometimes even like an esoteric knowledge, right? Or something which again kind of feeds. So I particularly like gnosis for jnana in this yeshe sense. Yeah, I'm just not even going to go. What I would say about reflexive awareness, svasamviti, is a feature of all. Now you can say the same thing about jnana, but let's just like typically, you wouldn't say that like your bog standard, like if I'm looking at a cup, that's yeshe or jnana, right? Typically. Versus like if you're going to, in a really kind of formal technical vocabulary, when we're doing Dharmakīrti Pramāṇa stuff, the sensory appearance of the cup and the conceptual awareness is also reflexive aware, right? That's the key point. Reflexive awareness is an inbuilt feature of each and every moment of awareness, just insofar as, or just because it is a moment of awareness. So whether you're conceptualizing a rope as a snake, or conceptualizing a rope, or you're seeing one manjushri or you're seeing two manjushris, in all cases, reflexive awareness is operative, right? No matter what. Which is a little, typically you would say jnana is like, that's reserved for meditation or something like that. Yeah, like when you're doing Mahamudra or whatever, and all the subject object stuff drops out, and there's just that pure luminosity, then you could call that jnana.
It's too far. Reflective awareness is what called Pramāṇavārttika into existence.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, no, because he was always existent, right? He's the 3 times. Yeah.
Here's my prayer, and he comes into being. But my point is just that this is the Dharma.
There's that good word that I used, matrix, right? The matrix of appearance and existence, the matrix of reality. The ground. I would say specifically, yes, reflexive awareness is the ground in the kind of technical sense.
And he can come into being, as Guru Rinpoche, let's say. Buddhists are aware of what's going on in a non-conceptual,
That's right.
non-dual way.
The only kind of awareness that remains after all error, all cognitive error, all distortion is gone is reflexive awareness. Did I know was Craig satisfied? Did he have any questions? Is he tuning in? You don't know? Seems call it satisfied.
And so this is another way of saying that nothing really exists without the apparatus defining, without the.
By apparatus, you mean pramana, the instrumentation. Like that's the key. That's the point. Is like, and again, so this is all this stuff about result. I kind of like glossed over because I don't want to get bogged down in Sanskrit grammar if I can help it. But all this stuff, what he was saying about reflexive awareness is the result. Like that's coming out of this grammatical analysis. And yeah, the idea here is whereas in the same way you could say like a microscope is an instrument for knowing very small things, or visual consciousness is an instrument for knowing extramental particles. Like when you really push it, that all gets dropped out. So what's left is the identity of the instrument the way that you know and the thing that you know become identical. That's a sense in which it's reflexive, intransitive grammatically. Like a transitive verb, he hits the table. He hits the table with a marker. Marker is the instrument of hitting the table. He hits himself with the marker. Intransitive, the agent and the object are the same, but the instrument is different. A reflexive awareness is aware of itself reflexively. Now there's no longer any distinction between the agent, the object, and the instrument. It's all one. It's all that one single moment of awareness, non-dual. People read it. I mean, we were over time. I apologize. We satisfied? Oh, thank you. Oh, goodness, no.
Alex, thank you.
No, thank you. No, thank you.
This was really an incredible introduction to Buddhist philosophy. I studied at Renjin Yeshe for more than a few